All right, so today we're going to be talking about Brown versus Board of Education as we continue to move on in our civil rights movement unit. So, Brown versus Board of Education was a very controversial Supreme Court decision in 1954. And this decision was actually a huge step in the right direction towards integration. Integration is the opposite of segregation. And so we talked about already how there was a lot of segregation related to all areas of life, and especially in the South with the Jim Crow laws. And so schools were one of the areas where this segregation happened. But after this case, there were steps towards integration that it didn't happen right away, and it was not an easy process, but this definitely ignited things and pushed things further in the right direction. And so when we think about inequality, just to review this idea, in the 1950s, 1960s, still, African Americans were not treated fairly. They're treated different from everybody else, and oftentimes it was just simply because of the color of their skin. So, as most of you know, this idea is called racism. So, there was so much racism still. We talked about in 1865 when slavery ended. You're talking about 100 years later, there was still racism across the country, and to the point where really there was a lot of segregation allowed, and even in the South, a lot of laws that made it where it was just a normal part of life. And so a lot of people had a hope that eventually things would change. Separate but equal, this idea that things could be separate but they're equal. That was how life was in America for a long time. And as we talked about already, the problem is separate never meant equal when you're talking about, schools and Black students who were not given the same education. So really here, it took this young girl and her father and several other families to help make this change in history, to be brave enough to say, even though this is how things are, how things continue to be, we have a hope that we can get this changed. And so in the 1950s, schools were a place where it was definitely clear that separate but equal was a normal part of life. And so some states spent so much less money on school buildings and teachers and books and resources for African American children. And so never did would people even, if you look at the two schools, would ever think that that word equal would be accurate when you're describing the segregated different schools. And so Linda Brown was a young third grader. She had to walk 1 mile across the railroad track. You're talking about a third grader. This is dangerous for one. And it was further this walk to her Black elementary school. There was actually a white school much closer to her home. And so her father, Oliver Brown, tried to enroll her in this school that was close, right down the road from her, but the principal refused to let her attend the white school. And so this was a door open to say, okay, let's show the world that this is not even making sense here. And so this idea of separate but equal was challenged. The father and several other families were angry that this all-white school was not available, and it was clearly a better school. It was housed close to where they lived, and so he argued that white schools and Black schools were not equal, and that never will things change unless we have this discussion of, all right, how is this fair? Things need to change, and legally there needs to be some changes. And so Linda Brown's father and 12 other families. It was basically Brown was put on the name of the case, but other families joined in with a similar situation. And the argument in court was led by Thurgood Marshall, a young lawyer who many of you know became an extremely important person in the civil rights movement and eventually a Supreme Court justice. While Thurgood Marshall was chosen to argue this case. It was called Brown versus the Board of Education, which is just the school district that made the decision that no, Linda Brown could not come to this school. And so in 1951, there was an original court case. Linda Brown's lawyer, Thurgood Marshall, argued that these separate schools went against what the 14th Amendment said. You have African Americans were citizens of the United States. Remember slavery, they were freed with the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, they were citizens that should have equal access to the rights that every citizen of the United States has. This was not happening, and Thurgood Marshall argued that this goes against our Constitution. In this smaller court, Thurgood Marshall lost the case. They did not rule for him. But what you can do in our court system is appeal and say, listen, we challenge this ruling. We don't agree with it. And eventually it actually got to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. And in 1954, Thurgood Marshall argued in front of the 9 Supreme Court justices about how this is unconstitutional. Separate but equal schools, it does not work. It's not something that our country should allow legally, and it was happening, and all 9 Supreme Court justices agreed unanimously that segregation in public schools should not be happening. It was not legal, and so they argued and that our country needed to change, and so they made it legally unconstitutional to have segregation in schools. And so schools all over the country, and specifically in the South where there was a lot of segregation, these schools were ordered to integrate as quickly as possible. The problem was this process was not very easy. A lot of people fought it. It didn't happen quickly. And it was a very messy, challenging, difficult, and dangerous situation to integrate these schools. So integration, it didn't happen overnight, but this really was the start. Brown versus Board of Education was the start of moving things in the right direction. And schools, in a lot of ways, led the way of integration. And eventually this would move into other areas because we talked about how segregation, drinking fountains, and public restrooms, and movie theaters, and restaurants, like all these places, it needed integration. And really, the schools, the ruling here, led the way to trying to have the reality of, okay, let's end this segregation in all these public areas. So we'll continue to talk about this. There's a brain pop that I'm going to have you guys watch, and we're going to study even more in detail Thurgood Marshall and his impact moving forward in this unit. You guys are awesome. Keep working hard.